Well, indeed, thank you, and good to see all of you. Really, this event marked the culmination of a 4-year project we've been holding here at the Center for Penal Theory and Penal Ethics at the University of Cambridge, led by Professor Ahmed Al-Qadain and me. Coming also resulting, of course, in this book, Rereading BECCARIA, and we were very fortunate to have been able to assemble some of the greatest minds thinking about criminal law today to reread BECCARIA with us and to write, of course, their contributions to this book. But before I discuss rereading BECCARIA, I should say a few words about the book we are rereading, which is Cesare BECCARIA's classic book on crimes and punishment from 1764, for which BECCARIA is known as a foremost figure of Italian Enlightenment. This is because he was able to encapsulate the thinking of the English and French philosophers of his time to formulate a whole new theory of criminal law, which until today marks the way we are thinking about criminal law and also about constitutional law. Some of the speakers after me will discuss this in more detail, but let's just quickly look at 4 innovations, specific innovations of BECCARIA. So BECCARIA called for the abolition of the death penalty and torture in interrogations. He also advocated for a very strict application of legality and the rule of law. That's one thing. B, BECCARIA originated a new and very humane concept of the social contract. It's a minimalist social contract in the sense it is very far from Hobbes' divided. Minimalist in the sense that citizens are only required to relinquish the minimum amount of their freedom necessary for the state to protect them against the perils of the state of nature, which is a humane form of contractualism. He laid the ground for the theory of deterrence and for the economic study and analysis of law. And D, of course, in criminological circles, and indeed in, I think, every criminology textbook, he is cited as the father of criminology in the classical school of criminology. And a very young father at that, because he wrote his theory at the tender age of 25. This leads me to say a few words about BECCARIA himself, the person. Now we'll speak about 2 aspects of BECCARIA that I find particularly alluring and interesting. One will be about BECCARIA the person, and another about his way of thinking, about his work, which was really obscured for 2 centuries and was rediscovered in mid-20th century. So first about BECCARIA's character and his temperament, and his way of being true to his nature, of his self, knowing what his nature is, and being true to his nature, which is exemplified in his larger-than-life Cinderella story into his reaction to that epoch. So prior to writing on Crimes and Punishment, again in 1764, BECCARIA was an undistinguished law graduate in Italy. Didn't have much to do with his time. But then 2 years prior to writing the book, he discovers, he stumbled upon, Montesquieu's Persian letters. He read this, was struck, and then he started to read every philosophical book he was able to put his hands on, and joined to form what was called then the Academy of Fisticuffs. This was in Milan, a vibrant group of Milanese youngsters, led by BECCARIA, but more than that, by Pietro Verri, who was an economist and a philosopher. And these guys would spend the afternoons roaming the streets and piazzas of Milan, many of which are now called after their names. So you can go through Milan and really get a sense of the history of that era. And they would discuss philosophy, discuss their ideas, and then each evening they would retire to Pietro Verri, his family mansion or palace, where each would be assigned a corner, and they would write their ideas down. Now, in this group, BECCARIA was the least prolific. didn't write anything, he didn't have any idea to write on. He was later called by Bentham the lazy genius. But then Berry prodded him to write about the question of crime and punishment, and he started writing. And it took him 10 months to write the treatise, which was published in July 1764, and it became an instant hit, right? It was one of the biggest bestsellers of its time, obviously criticized by the Roman Church, criticized by conservative jurists, but praised by philosophers such as Hume and Voltaire, mainly Voltaire. So it was received well, and instantaneously the career was transferred or transformed from obscurity into eminence, from fandom into stardom, from being an admirer of the philosophers to being an admired philosopher all in his own right. And he was invited in 1766 to join the French philosophers in the saloons lecture saloons of Paris. He went there. It was a great honor. He was received well, but he found that it wasn't for him. So this is in stark contrast to what we know today as celebrity culture. The honor was not for him. He cut his trip short, and then he rejected Catherine the Great's invitation to come to St. Petersburg to join her in reformulated and forming the Russian criminal code. And he stayed in his hometown in Milan, and never to leave its vicinity again. Now, after his return, he was offered a chairship, a chair in political economy in the University of Milan. He took that job, but here still, the owners didn't really speak to him. He said, that's not really what I want to do in life. Left his post after 2 years only and joined the Lombard administration, a much more humble job, not very glamorous, but where he really found his calling. This is why I say he was true to himself. And he spent unglorious, perhaps, but very productive and enjoyable years until his death in 1794. So this is one aspect of his writing, which I find, of his life and writing, which I found very interesting. But if you go to the writing, BECCARIA, of course, is known as a reformer, is known as someone who influenced the way we think about criminal law. You know, he's known as a person who originated many ideas. But it is important to notice, and it wasn't noticed, as I said, for 2 centuries, that his writing is very subtle. So he's an innovator, but he's also subtle. He's way ahead of his time. In what sense? So let's look at 2 aspects of his writing. So one thing is that BECCARIA is obviously known as utilitarian, as a person moving forward the idea of deterrence. That's, of course, a ranking way. So Bentham then makes a big deal about BECCARIA being utilitarian in order to bask in BECCARIA's glory at the time and put forward his own idea of deterrence. Immanuel Kant, coming also after BECCARIA, cited BECCARIA as a utilitarian in order to criticize him, but it was 2 centuries later that Hart actually discovered that we cannot say that BECCARIA was a true utilitarian. And why? Of course, he mentioned deterrence, but he insisted on just treatment of the accused. He insisted on the presumption of innocence. We advocated the abolition of the death penalty and of torture and interrogation. Now, this would not be the ideas of a consistent utilitarian. So this is really a mixed theory. What Hart said is that this BECCARIA was not the originator only of deterrence theory, but also of the mixed theory of punishment in criminal law. Was an instrumentalist, but also a moralist. This is one thing. Another thing is criminology. He is cited as the forefather of the classical school of criminology, meaning that he was really, he believed in the free will of the offender. Right? Offenders make a rational choice when offending, then you can curb their enthusiasm by the prospect of punishment. And you proportion the punishment to the offender's crime or his expected gains. Okay, so that was ridiculed, obviously, in the 19th century when criminology took a whole other path, more physical type of path. But then in the mid-20th century, when free will was back in fashion in criminology, it was discovered also that BECCARIA was not, it didn't take free will to its absolute and really ridiculous conclusions. He wrote that free will is always tempered by the offender's background, by socio-economical conditions. It's not complete free will. You can be rational, but only to a point. Which leads to the question of why we read BECCARIA, why should we do that now, the question about this project, and what we were trying to do with this project. Really, why should contemporary criminal law thinkers be interested in BECCARIA? Why should they, if they have the advantage of 2.5 centuries of post-BECCARIan thinking, why go back to BECCARIA? So our idea here really was to form a mechanism of alienation. Mechanism you think of estrangement, make you think about your current thinking, current work, current theory in a new light. So we asked our contributors to imagine that BECCARIA was this enigmatic retired professor who was coming to the room and asked, the eternal question, what are you working on? And we mentioned a conversation with BECCARIA and really to see their own thinking through fresh eyes, which leads to the question, can you really call fresh eyes that have been shut in 1794? So for this, I want in conclusion to conjure a fellow of King's College, Cambridge, just down the road from where we are now, at the Institute of Criminology, the late Professor Bernard Williams. And Williams, in one of his essays for the London Review of Books, wrote, and I'll quote this. So this is Williams. In the analytic tradition, the standard assumption is that philosophical inquiry does not need to bother much with its history. The distinctive philosophers is reflection, and reflection, roughly speaking, will see them through. But in ethical and political cases, at least, the assumption is wrong. More insight will come from seeing how we came to where we are. This is Williams, and all I can say is, indeed. Thank you very much.
The screen. There we are. So as it is a pleasure to talk about BECCARIA. I grew up in Milan myself, and as a small boy, I always visited the center of the city, and I vividly remember seeing a statue just beyond the Dome of Milan. And it turns out that was the statue of BECCARIA. But for the longest time, I asked myself, who is BECCARIA? And it's only much later on that I started understanding the huge importance that BECCARIA had in Milan and in Europe at the time. But I would say, with Shaka, that BECCARIA's thinking ushered in a form of revolution, Copernican revolution in thinking about the law and in particular the reform of criminal law in order to suit the many rather than to pay lip service to the interest of the few. And this is the gist of what I want to say today. BECCARIA was truly a reformer. And some people, some analytical philosophers would sneer at why should we read Beccaria, his booklet is just a tiny little pamphlet and doesn't deserve a very close philosophical attention. But that would be a mistake. It would be a mistake because Beccaria is unlike other analytical philosophers. Beccaria is a philosopher who wants to make a difference in the world. And these ideas of reform of criminal law started the most sweeping revolution, bringing criminal codification throughout Europe and reaching all the way to the Empress Catherine II of Russia. So while, of course, his book is not a treaty, comprehensive treaty, it can be considered as a true manifesto of revolutionary ideas. Although to the extent to which Beccaria was a revolutionary, it's much discussed. In fact, you could compare the way in which France, only 25 years after the booklet, brought about the French Revolution in violent ways. In Italy, the law reform did not go down that way. It was a slow and steady reform. So to this extent, Beccaria was a sort of a reformer, not a revolutionary. The question is, why was Beccaria so adamant and so passionate about reform, wanting to reform the law? And the main worry that he had back then, which I think we can easily share also nowadays, was the problem of inequality and the problem of entrenched privilege. He was an aristocrat, and his family and his class was a ruling class in Milan, but he felt that the privilege of the ruling class were too many and were completely inconsistent with the interests of the society at large. And he saw that as a fundamental problem of a split, polarized society. So in order to fight against that, he came up with this maxim that la massima felicità nel maggior numero, as in the greatest happiness in the greatest number, that was then picked up by Bentham and used it as a utilitarian manifesto, although we could discuss very much the differences between Beccaria and utilitarian. Now, we can discuss the differences because the project of Beccaria was much broader than a utilitarian project. And the revolution that he ushered in consisted in trying to bring the insights of political economy and formulate a science of man. So the writers of law at the time of Beccaria were either inspired by Hobbes or were trying to depart from Hobbes. And there was an insight that Beccaria really tried to fend off, namely that you need a contract to move from a state of nature into an organized, orderly society. And Beccaria went rather with Rousseau's idea of a contract, namely the idea that every one of us acts on the basis of rational interest. And there is a way in which we can organize rational interest and make our actions respond to rational interest. This way, for Beccaria, as much as Hume or Smith, was in the understanding of political economy. And for those of you who do not know Beccaria at all, he actually became the holder of the first chair of political economy and not in Milan. So the second point of this revolution, Copernican revolution, is something that has been embraced by the school of legal positivism up until H.L.A. Hart here in the UK. It's the fundamental idea that someone who is interested in the law should try to demystify the law rather than make it an object of veneration. So Beccaria was a law student, but he was completely put off by the study of the law in Milan. He saw it as a hodgepodge of Roman law, Byzantine law, Lombard customs, and the rambling of very confused and vague jurists. So it was something that was instrumental to defend the interest of the ruling class, but something that nobody could use to protect the interest of the people at large. So rather than having this very Byzantine mumbo jumbo of norms, Beccaria wanted to put forward a very simple model of law, as in legislation. Law would be equated to one source, that is to say, the source of legislation, and legislation would be emanated by the voice of the people. This was the key philosophical insight, and as I said, H.L.A. Raz, as positivist to this day, recognized the importance of the idea of demystifying law. There is a sort of hidden thread from Beccaria to Raz that characterizes all of them. Now, I would skip this part only to focus on another aspect of the revolution. The contract proposed by Beccaria was a compromise. He didn't want to pretend that the social contract at the basis of civil order would be an ideal contract, but one of the key ideas that he proposed was the idea that we should aim at the minimum interference through coercion. So every government will have to use coercion, but the point of legitimacy of a government is to aim at the minimum possible extent of coercion and the maximum possible welfare. I think this encapsulates the program of Beccaria very well. It is something that we would do well to consider even nowadays. That is to say, in practical terms, Beccaria wanted much less criminal law and criminal enforcement and much more welfare state in terms of educating people and giving people the right opportunities in order to prevent crime by creating a better welfare state. This is the somehow socialist kind of gist of Beccaria. People would laugh at this characterization, although Beccaria was the first philosopher in the world to be accused of being a socialist by the Catholic Church, of course, was very, very concerned that the secular ideas of Beccaria would swipe away the civil order as propounded by the Catholic Church and the Catholic moral principles. So to fend off his threats, they accused him of being a socialist. And in history, this is the recorded first time of this label being used. But in terms of his secular ideas, the fundamental distinction that Beccaria insisted upon was perhaps, again, revolutionary, was the distinction between sin and crime. So he wanted to separate the understanding of crime from the theological apparatus. So whatever is has to do with crime can be of the domain of the church, and that's fair enough. crime has nothing to do with sin. Crime is something that it has to be understood within the context of the secular state. And that's how he came to his secular definition of crime, and something that resonates with Bentham and Mill in particular, who wrote 50 years after. The true measure of crime is harm to society. So this definition is key to the revolution ushered in by Montesquieu, by Beccaria. And it's very important to understand it because up until then, sin and crime would essentially form one single unit. And that led to a number of proposals for reform. The ideas can be discussed at length, but I just sketched the very big lines of reforms that Beccaria proposed. Of course, he insisted on the fact that crimes must be issued by legislation. They must have a very high degree of certainty, and punishments must follow a strict law of proportionality. So it doesn't make any sense to punish different crimes in the same way. You would just give the wrong message to people. If you can steal and murder and be punished at the same time in the equal way as just a simple theft, then many people would rationally adopt a way that makes it easier to get away with the murder. But Beccaria's aim was that of reducing the overall violence against society, and in particular the violence against the weakest member of the society. So I hope that by now it is clear what Beccaria is up to. He's really concerned that the few and the interest of the few, of the billionaires, if you want, nowadays we would call them, would trump the interest of the many, and that would be in the long run the recipe for disaster, social disaster in the community at large. Sure, many people would get richer and richer, but the society would be poorer and poorer, more and more divided, more polarized, and the civil order would break down. So the conclusion has to do with the constitutional aspect of Beccaria's criminal thinking. So what is characteristic about the idea of criminal law from a Beccarian point of view is that it's not a sui generis discipline that tracks moral wrongs and somehow tries to make sense of itself from within. No, crime and punishment are bread and butter of state practice. And as such, they have to be used in a very wise, rational, proportionate way. And in order to do so, you have to put in place constitutional guarantees that will make the legislator always very wary of over-criminalizing, creating new crimes, and so on and so forth. Rather, with these constitutional guarantees in place, there will always be a safeguard against criminalization and excess punishment. So that is the spirit with which Beccaria was writing, and I end up again, why with Beccaria today? Well, as I said, there is a double challenge. He had a double challenge, but it's the same for us. The rise of inequality and the rise of criminalization are widespread the world over nowadays. They seem to go hand in hand, and they seem to be unstoppable. So if you buy into the spirit of Beccaria, in order to counteract the spread of inequality and criminalization, you would have to argue in favor of more social justice and less criminal punishment. Thank you very much.
So as I was reading towards the work on this project on BECCARIA, I was also thinking how relevant is BECCARIA today, and I just happened at the same time to read a new, or relatively new, decision out of the Supreme Court of Israel, a criminal case that had actually cited BECCARIA whilst they were discussing why there should be a difference between the treatment of someone who was bankrupt, did not commit fraud, and someone who committed fraud and bankrupt there. So obviously, even in current criminal legal practice, still has great relevance. But in my chapter, I am interested in what is the constitutional relationship between the citizen and the state as envisaged by the criminal law according to BECCARIA. And I think that's been mentioned already in different ways. For BECCARIA, in his really quite short book, there are two such bases for the relationship between the citizen and the state. So one is the social contract that he talks about, and then at other places, he is a utilitarian. He talks about utilitarianism. And it's not entirely clear what is the relationship between these two bases. So even the utilitarianism, as was mentioned here, the most happiness shared by the largest number of people is already utilitarianism with some logical component in it. So when we're talking about shared how, does it mean equal to each? Is it shared according to some other component of value, of worth? But we know that it has to be shared. So that's utilitarianism, but in other places, he talks about a social contract. Again, I'll mention in a minute, it's a question what kind of social contract. I thought that the best way to reconcile the two, I think, is that he says, well, we have to assume the existence of a social contract, but the content of the social contract, which obviously it's the factual hypothetical contract, which we must assume that the society must have agreed to, it must be the case that it should be a utilitarian contract. And the two maybe ways to approach the social contract. So one is the Hobbesian, which I think is the one that Locke is close, saying that BECCARIA is closest to, and that is indeed the contract of self-interested parties who all agree to give up some part of their liberty in order to protect their own interests, in contrast to the other, the Kantian approach, which is a moral code that is mutually enforceable. But I think it's closer to the first one. If indeed there is a social contract as a basis for the relationship between the citizen and the state as envisaged by the criminal law, if this is the basis for theory of criminalization, is that something that can be sustained? We haven't seen very much development in the argument specifically of a social contract as a basis for theory of criminalization. Matt Mataverse, who is one of the contributors to the book, has written about this, I think, first of the modern people who have tackled that. But I think there is still missing an argument as to why, even there is a social contract, why it necessarily should be upheld by the criminal law. There are certainly many other ways for society to uphold it, if indeed we proceed with this metaphor of the contract. Why not use contract law to enforce it, or similar private arrangements for enforcing it? or indeed, even if there is to be a central mechanism, any kind of governmental administrative means could enforce it. So we're still missing an argument as to why it should be the criminal law, but certainly. But then I ask, okay, so what happens if the government breaches the social contract? So under, again, envisage the social contract in two different ways, either one in which the government is a party to the social contract, or one in which the government is not a party, it's only the individual, other parties to the social contract, but the government enforces it. I think either way, this is a valid question. What happens when the government breaches the contract? And that is why I wanted to look at this question. I think that comes into sharp focus, especially when the government argues that someone has committed an offense of treason, or offense against the state itself. For BECCARIA, this wasn't an issue at all. For him, treason was the highest offense. There was absolutely no right to disobey, and that was the end of it. I will talk a bit more later. Voltaire, who was a very enthusiastic supporter of the commentary about him, actually departed from him on this point. Then the American Revolution, well, who talk a little bit about the ways in which they followed or did not follow BECCARIA, but certainly great interest in his writing. Here had departed from his approach, and we can see why. So, say, why should some individual obey the social contract if the government has breached it? So, if someone the government claims has committed an act of treason, but the individual will tell us, well, it's the government which has departed from the constitution of the state. What I was doing was not treasonous. It was, yes, against the government, but actually in support of the constitutional principles of the state. There is an issue here, of course, of who makes the decision, and that was the reason that Emmanuel said, even though he was a supporter of the French Revolution, but on this question, he said, no, not everyone can start making their own judgments on what and when the government has departed from the social contract. This is up to the government to decide, and everyone should obey. Locke, famously in the Second Treatise of Government, recognized a right to revolt if there is a despotic government, if the government itself is breaching the social contract and breaching the constitution guarantees that it is supposed to uphold. So I think already we can see here that social contract will have difficulty in justifying an offense of treason, which is entirely dependent on the government claiming that someone had disobeyed its orders, because there might be a good reason for that. And if that's not something that can come into the considerations here, we can see this is problematic. I argue that the theory of criminalization cannot justify one offense, then it has a problem. It's not enough that it can obviously justify others. Here, as I said, Voltaire also departed from BECCARIA, and he in fact pointed out something that in a very different way Blackstone pointed out as well. What has happened with the offense of treason is that in fact an individual cannot know if they have committed treason in the midst of a civil war or a chain of rulers, a battle between rulers, because they don't know at the time who will be victorious. So obeying the victorious ruler will mean that you are loyal and not treasonous, but obeying the king who was imposed or the ruler who lost will have the opposite effect, criminal effect, on your status under a criminal law. Blackstone gives, in fact, historical examples. We can mention Richard III in elsewhere as well. And Voltaire actually uses that example to say, well, there is a difference between moral offenses and political offenses, natural offenses and political offenses. Of course, political offenses are exactly that. These kinds of offenses of treason, seditious, similar offenses, when they are used in this way, that in fact it's the political allegiance, whether it is proved to be the victorious side or the losing side, that can decide the fate of an individual, and that, he says, is illegitimate. So I examine several other issues in my chapter in relation to BECCARIA. So one issue that I'm interested in more develop now is that of extradition. To what extent can extradition and the reasons for which states don't extradite, such as the political offense exception, what extent they can be explained under this theory of social contract. And I argue that it's difficult to explain them, especially under BECCARIA's type of social contract theory, maybe easier under the theory of someone like.
Thank you very much. So my idea here is to pick up where Anat left off with the idea that thinking about ourselves as sort of held, living in a community that's held together by us, that can help us in limiting the authority of the state. But my focus is on BECCARIA's own central concern, which was to demonstrate in that way the impermissibility of the death penalty. And BECCARIA's main argument against the death penalty is deceptively simple, and you can probably guess it by now from all that you have heard from my predecessor. He says, if it is indeed the case that we submit to authority, to a system of government, because we seek security from the violations we might otherwise suffer in the state of nature, how can we be taken to have permitted that authority to destroy us, which is the very opposite of the protection we seek? As was mentioned, his idea is that unlike Hobbes, who thought that in order to have any kind of government that can protect us against anything, we would have to consider ourselves as having signed away all our rights, and having completely submitted ourselves to the power of that authority that is absolute. BECCARIA thought that we have to think of what is held by the ruler as the smallest amounts of freedom. The ruler is a repository of the smallest amounts of our freedoms necessary to achieve the mutual protection of our rights. And so public authority is a repository of freedom. And he writes with striking rhetoric in his book that how on earth can the minimum sacrifice of each individual's freedom involve handing over our greatest of all our good, life itself. And for BECCARIA, this is simply powerful. Now, what I want to do in my presentation is I will say a few words about the flack he got from other philosophers who are making this kind of argument, and then respond to various challenges by other philosophers. But I will also then say something about the, in some sense, difficulties that emerged when public authorities at the time were inspired by this call to abolish the death penalty into actually doing that, into trying to do without. And that I looked at in particular in relation to the Habsburg Empire, of which, as we heard from Shahar, BECCARIA as a public servant was actually hard. So, first of all, let's look at the philosopher's reaction. So, another BECCARIA scholar has noted that the really interesting point in BECCARIA's argument against it is not that he makes this argument, you know, the point had occurred to others, but that he stops there, that he says this is the positive of the matter. It is just inconceivable that anyone in their self-interest would permit a government to kill them, even by way of, you know, enforcing some whatever otherwise legitimate law, and even on the now, Rousseau had, and she said what was the tradition amongst contractarian philosophers before and after BECCARIA was very much to think that that shouldn't be their conclusion, and therefore to come up with some case as to why the death penalty was still legitimate. And Rousseau had offered a conception of the general will, which sort of put a distance between the interests of the individual and the interests that can be seen as you know, a proper use of public power. So that's what people subscribe to when they are considered as of politics. Against the politics also, nobody has any true political rights. This notion of the general will that Rousseau supports is one where we don't even need to be, we don't need to have rights against, you know, our collective, collectively expressed best interest, because why would we? And BECCARIA, in a sideline, says, I'm not buying into this. He doesn't accept Rousseau's conception of the voluntary will at all. He says that general will is just the aggregate of individual will. It's just the aggregate of individual interests. So you have to legitimate what you do through your public institutions, also and always against each individual person affected by those decisions. And as we well know, took a different line in making a case for the death penalty. And because he is such a revered philosopher in the history of philosophy, and because he was in some ways a very influential thinker in terms of, you know, building the foundations of public law, it is often overlooked why we might find that case completely unpersuasive. So Kant says, oh, well, BECCARIA is completely on the wrong track in thinking or even finding relevant what a natural person that we imagine as an everyday kind of guy might think about how they should be. Nobody needs to consent to their own punishment as an empirical. Rather, we have to think about the matter by imagining a split between our empirical selves, you know, our, you know, embodied people with all sorts of flaws, all sorts of unreasonable interests, all sorts of passions, and our numinals. Our numinal selves are the ones that matter. And this is what we recognize, and it's through our numinal selves that we recognize that by doing an evil thing, by committing murder, we have also committed ourselves to being killed ourselves in this conflict. Now, I think the important point here is to realize that if you don't accept the metaphysics behind this, if you don't accept that splitting off of the person into a numinal self and an empirical self, no case for permitting the death penalty has been made, let alone a case for considering it obligatory through that line of reasoning. And BECCARIA, one of the things that are still fascinating about the way he writes is perhaps one of the first people who sees the criminal also as an ordinary human being trying to make what seems, you know, the best thing in the circumstances for him. So so he actually views anyone who commits a crime as someone who is an embedded self, with flaws, of course, but where then the reaction cannot come from anything like an implied self-commitment that is based on the rationality of that person. And so that's really interesting, I think, for philosophers to reflect on, that the Kantian case for the death penalty is unbelievably weak. It is based on a notion of the person that we would not nowadays accept. That in fact, I haven't found any interpretation. Now, at the time, BECCARIA, and even until the present day, BECCARIA was often accused of being a sentimentalist. And that is why he is. He just can't handle it. You know, criminal justice should be harsh, must be harsh, should be deterrent. But it isn't something that, he's just too weak. But I don't think that that is really where he's coming from. Many of the details he offers are appeals also to the rulers of his time to just see the brutality of the criminal justice system and its practices for what they are. And for what they are for BECCARIA is atrocities committed in the name of criminal justice, rather than something that can be given any justification as being a proper counteraction, something that is required by religious belief systems, and so on and so forth. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, he managed to inspire some of the rulers of his time to try and implement the abolition of the death penalty. And the two central figures here are brothers. The eldest son of Maria Theresa, the Habsburg empress at the time, called Joseph, who was also her co-regent for the last 20 years of her life, and who was responsible in a sense for the Austrian heartlands, for those Austrian domains that included Milan. And his younger brother, Leopold, as he was called, who very, very briefly followed Joseph on the throne, and who was under a completely different constitutional route, responsible for Tuscany. And Leopold II, or Pietro Leopoldi, as he was called when he lived in Italy, became responsible for Tuscany at a very, very young age. When his father had died, actually more or less on his wedding night, on Leopold's wedding night, I think he was about 18 years old. So he had read all the, great books of the time, and he wanted to abolish the death penalty. The interesting thing, always in that story, there will be reports that have been taken from the eminent judges of the day, and the eminent judges are bound to recommend that the death penalty cannot possibly be abolished, because what on earth would they do without it? How could they possibly control crime? So this, of course, also happened to Leopold. But Leopold was a smart mover, and he was able to get, in a sense, his domain to accept a relatively brief criminal code based on what was probably the first statistical inquiry into what punishments had actually been meted out for what crimes in the few years that were running up to those reforms. I think he looked at the last 20 years, and where he was therefore able to defend abolition to a public that was not necessarily very welcoming of it. Now, the brothers seem to have been in some kind of quiet competition about who was going to manage the greater feast in criminal law reform. And Joseph, who was a perfectionist and certainly less of a humanist, had swallowed hook and sinker the utilitarian case for abolishing the death penalty. You could have more deterrent penalties, and if you then make the people who you no longer punish by death visibly suffer for the rest of their lives, wouldn't that be an even better means of, sending the messages that criminal justice wants to send than punishing them by death, where they might even, be pitied by their fellow citizens who aren't so focused on thinking about their crimes anymore? Well, this Joseph had what was for Joseph the main motivation for abolishing the death penalty, and he therefore instituted replacement penalties, including the pulling of ships up the Danube, work that was otherwise done by animals or by very unwilling locals who were simply strong-armed into this kind of activity, and where people then died by the dozens. He was extremely unwilling to rethink that aspect of abolition. And part of why the death penalty had not yet been abolished under the rule of Joseph's mother, Maria Theresa, even though it had been looked into again and again, was that the reports that kept coming back from the administration was, well, if we really want to put people in prison for a long, long time, with a view to them actually surviving this for a long, long time, we need new prisons. We can't continue with the dungeons without windows under old castles that we currently have. And there is very, very interesting literature that is now available on the states of the places of detention in the Habsburg Empire. They were simply not fit for purpose when it came to anything like a considerable time of imprisonment. So I think for us today, for me certainly, the biggest message is, can there really be a case against abolishing the death penalty when we know that we have alternative punishments that are not going to be more deadly or worse, and that we could use instead? Certainly, the idea BECCARIA had that we should think about the modes of punishments as something that a person should be able to consent to, as something they are prepared to suffer in response to a crime they have committed, is a thought that should carry us forward in current thinking about modes of punishment as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've put my remarks: history, methodology, and humanism, and the C word. C word being criminology. These three ideas are loosely related: history, methodology, humanism. They're also related to what I discussed in my chapter. My chapter was a gallop through things that I found interesting in the book. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the chapter now, partly because there isn't time, but also because I'm a bit hazy about what I said. It's now a very long time since we commenced on this fantastic project. And I did want to just acknowledge the enormous amount of work over a long period of time that Chateau and Adja in particular put in to bring this project to fruition. It began in the BC before COVID, and it's struggled through, and I'm so pleased. This is the first time I've seen it. Brilliant, well done. The project is called Rereading BECCARIA. Now, if you're me, the project was about reading BECCARIA rather than rereading BECCARIA. And I won't go around the room and test you, but I'm guessing there are at least some people in the room who are in similar condition to me than I was before I embarked upon this very interesting collaboration. Is it worth reading? Well, of course it's worth reading. It's a famous book. If you're interested in penalty, penology, criminology, criminal law, It's of interest, of course it is. It's actually quite short, so it won't take you very long. And you're surprised. Well, you won't now, because you've heard all the presentations, but if you were like me, and before tonight, you'd be surprised because you might have heard of here as some kind of old-time penal theorist who wrote about topics in chronology and is a kind of grandfather of chronology and criminologists. Chacon mentioned. I was astonished when I actually read the book that quite a lot of it is about criminal procedure and evidence, which is my thing. So that's quite interesting to me. You may find lots of things of interest to you if you read it. That being said, it's not just a question of whether it's worth reading, is it? There is, after all, opportunity cost. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there. There's even more stuff than there was when I was a student here, and the stuff continues to grow. So there's a question of, opportunity cost and using your attention resources effectively. Why would you read it? Well, again, clearly the book is of historical interest. If you had a kind of antiquarian view about the development of the history of ideas in chronology, or you were interested in tracing ideas to their historical source, it has that historical context value. But can we go beyond that? My chapter is called BECCARIA Now. I'm interested in the sailors for today. As we know from Historiography 101, history is a relationship. History is about how we view the past from the present. Present is always changing, so the past is always changing. You don't have to be some crazy postmodernist to do that. That's very clear. This is just true, methodologically. So, as our times change and we look back to BECCARIA from our perspective and with our interests nowadays, the question is, who is BECCARIA for us? What is it telling us now? That's the history part. Methodology, second. Allied to which is the idea of the constitution and boundaries of disciplines. Having a clear methodology and linking that to disciplinary questions and interests is essential to the constitution of disciplinary identity. I know obviously we're interested in interdisciplinarity, everyone is, but interdisciplinarity makes no sense unless you can identify disciplines first and then inquire how they interrelate with one another. So I always thought, as a part-time criminologist in former life, that criminology was endlessly fascinated with these questions of disciplinary constitution. What is criminology? What methods contribute to it? How is it demarcated from other disciplines? And so on and so on. How does BECCARIA relate to all of this? Well, of course, BECCARIA's not a criminologist. Why not? Because criminology wasn't invented for another, well, it depends, discussed, but at least another 100 years, and arguably another 150 years. If you go down David Garland line, that criminology is a modern discipline, is really constituted by the amalgam of the project of government with a positivistic social science, or a positivistic, anyway, generally methodological inquiry, which only really comes to the fore at the earliest of the late 19th century. So BECCARIA himself is not a criminologist. However, it is good for all disciplines to have a sense of their history and their historical roots and their historical development. I'm struck nowadays by a pervasive presentism in everything, kind of living in the moment. We used to say that today's news headlines are tomorrow's fish and chip wrapping. Well, that's an analog version of what happens in the digital world, right? Think about government. Governments come and go. We can hardly remember who they are. Some of them seem quite familiar from the ones we had before. But what it does show you, though, is that a sense of history and governance is not very good for a lack of that sense of history is not very good for effective government. Now, you may say that, I can possibly comment. I do want to say that a lack of a sense of history and a presentism is definitely bad for disciplines. So one thing that a discipline of criminology can think about is its history and its historical antecedents, not out of antiquarian interest, but as a question of identity, formation, consolidation, and a way of going on now. Second brief methodological point. You'll have already picked up from what's been said that BECCARIA has a broad approach to questions of criminal justice and penalty. He wants to put it in the context of, well, political economy might be one description. You might also talk about projects of governance. I mentioned that already. You know, Foucault, governmentality, that comes in as well. It all links in. I think this is very interesting because I always worried, and I do worry, that projects of inquiry that fixate narrowly on particular issues, like, for example, prisons, or the problem of punishment, or the problem of the criminal law, it's very easy to get kind of tunnel vision around that. It's very easy to become siloed in your thinking and to go down rabbit holes and to lose the big picture. BECCARIA is constantly pulling us back away from that. He's constantly saying, no, look at this in the broader context. Look at this as an issue of political theory, as a matter of governance, as a matter of politics. And I think that's very valuable today. Thirdly, final idea, humanism. I could have said secular liberal humanism. That's already come out in the presentations, but that's far too many ideas for this time in proceedings when a wider section of legal ways. So I'll stick with just the humanism. And what I want to say about this is that I used to be quite impatient intellectually with a lack of systematic thinking. I think that attempts to incorporate multiple ideas were muddled, and that what was required was to sort out those ideas and systematize them. At some point in my intellectual journey, I became a pluralist, and now I speak about pluralism with the zeal of converts. This makes me sympathetic to BECCARIA when he is chided by the likes of Bentham. Bentham thought that BECCARIA was just muddled, and if only he could sort out utilitarianism, it would be a much better theorist. Hart goes as far as to say that, according to Bentham thought, that BECCARIA was just lazy and just couldn't knuckle down and do it properly. I mean, clearly, Bentham was a prodigious author and used to work like steam. So from his perspective, I suppose everyone would look lazy. But in any event, I think this view that good ideas are systematic is probably false and often dangerous. So that really what saves BECCARIA, in my view, from the perspective of today, is precisely that he is constantly pulled back by his humanistic intuitions and his staunch refusal to allow real embodied human beings rather than human cells to become victims of ideas that are far too clever for their own good. Now, is On Crimes and Punishments a work of great philosophy? No, it's not. It's not. It didn't set out to be, and it's not a great work of philosophy. Is On Crimes and Punishments a great work of criminal procedural evidence? No, it certainly isn't. It's quite interesting, but in my chapter, you'll see I've got some things to say about where I think BECCARIA is horribly confused in his account of criminal procedural reforms and the rationale for them. We still see the value of a pluralistic approach, one rooted in humanism, for BECCARIA going forward. He reminds me in this regard of others who are accused of being muddled, like, for example, Mill. It always strikes me that what saves Mill from being Bentham is precisely his commitment to individual liberty that Bentham doesn't have. And people might think that that makes Mill a confused utilitarian. I just think it makes him a better humanist. Now, to bring this together, some of what BECCARIA writes seems naive, hopelessly optimistic. I mean, it's striking really because historically, his position is somewhat precarious. You know, I mean, the people could have come knocking. So, in some respects, his optimism for the future is quite endearing and contrary to his personal experience, you might think. I don't think we can share that, you know, unmitigated sense of optimism. I mean, we live in a place now that might be called penalty after Auschwitz. And after Auschwitz, you can no longer have simplistic faith in progress, enlightenment, that everything will turn out to be the best for everyone in the best possible world. You no longer have that. Nonetheless, if you think about the intervention of another Italian theorist, somewhat later, Cesare Lombroso, Lombroso thought that BECCARIA's penal project had failed, and it needed to be replaced with a positivist science criminology. And Lombroso, I quote this in my chapter, says, you know, the problem with BECCARIA is he thinks that criminals are like ordinary humans. That's almost a direct quote. I paraphrase slightly. You can imagine where that leads in the late 19th century, the earliest 20th century, and indeed some of you may know this is a somewhat dark chapter of criminology where it gets associated with eugenic ideas and all kinds of nonsense in the early 1910s and 1920s. Seems to me BECCARIA's muddled humanistic ideas have been proved to be on the right side of history when it comes to criminological ideas. And let me conclude then with a quotation from someone lately of this parish, Leon Radzinovich. Radzinovich says, BECCARIA's language is non-technical and forceful. He combined eloquence of expression with strictly logical reasoning. That's too favorable anyway. But far above these accomplishments of form stands his profound humanity. His ardent belief in human reason and the perfectibility of social institutions, which he instilled into everything he wrote, and which make his book such inspiring reading. His faith in progress was intense. From every page of his book flows that serene and confident hope of which Europe was then so much in need. We still need it in the highly unlikely event that people are still writing about me 200 years after my death. I hope to say something like that. That's why you should read it.
Before opening matters to a quick Q&A, I would like to say something on behalf of the Center for Penal Theory and Ethics. Let me start by saying that the entire project happened before I arrived at the center, so I have no credit whatsoever, but I take great delight on this volume having been produced. There's a famous saying that the history of Western philosophy is a footnote on Plato. I'm not going to suggest that BECCARIA is the Plato of criminology, but there is something similar here, as the presentations today reveal, and as any of the chapters will reveal as well. BECCARIA is not just an antiquarian or historical. I never met my colleague or Robert before, but I could have, had I prepared remarks, we have very many similar things. So I found myself surprised to find so much relevance in this in every chapter in this book. Unlike Plato, Beccaria is a neglected figure. So here you have a case in which this looking at the past is not merely about reinventing the wheel. It's seeing how it speaks to us about contemporary issues and seeing how the one speaking to us is someone who is rather systematically neglected. I grew up in Venezuela where Beccaria was known, but my experience in the US was different. This was virtually unknown. I think most people would read Beccaria rather than rereading. So I think it's a wonderful volume, and I'm just expressing my delight on behalf of the center. So with that, anyone has questions? Yes, Maria.
Hi, thank you. Thanks to everybody. What a fantastic, very intriguing presentations. I was by the idea of Beccaria on linking crime with harm. And I couldn't help thinking about the wonderful work that was carried out in our department about the crime harm index and the fact that the colleagues tried to remind us that let's not just look about the crime event, but also try to think about it in relation to tangible and intangible costs. So I would like to invite the panel if they would like to share their thoughts about how. I was also particularly intrigued by the last speaker, and I agree that it's always important as scholars that we read and reread the current, the past and the present. So how would we reread, how would Beccaria reread the literature within our department, the fantastic research of our department on the crime harm index?
Well, maybe I could be the first person to say something about that, but I think what I want to do is explain why Beccaria was so wary of focusing on anything other than harm. So his focus on harm, his focus on the social cost, the social impact of criminal behavior is really also his way of contrasting it towards a focus on sin, what is in the mind of the criminal, and what are to him very entrenched but irrational ways of relating to the commission of harm. Othering criminals has a much longer tradition, not quite unbroken, but a much longer tradition than I think is often realized, in that the sinner was set apart. He set himself apart. He needed to undergo some ritual in order to re-enter the flock. And when public authority saw itself in part justified as providing the ritual, that is when you got all these extremely expressive and brutal punishments. You know, the death penalty is a simplification. You know, there were forms of imposing death that were linked to extreme levels of suffering, and that were in part justified by a public authority that claimed to be doing the work of God. So I think that I also think that there is in some sense a precursor here, because Beccaria does have this awareness that if you focus on the social cost of rights violating conduct, then you will differentiate between different types of harms as being more or less serious. I'm not sure that he would necessarily have always agreed that that economic harm has to be ranked below harm to the physical person, but certainly you see the beginnings of that. And his idea of proportionate punishment is one that that connects to that. And the bit I didn't mention in my presentation was how even those ideas proved extremely difficult to implement by people who were inspired by Beccaria. So Jefferson produced a proposal for his fellow revolutionaries in the American Revolution's context, where he had his proposal for proportioning crimes to punishments, and it was an abomination. There were a lot of physically invasive punishments, and it was clearly not a successful attempt to work with Beccaria's set of ideas. So I think the crime harm index is a way of, I suppose, giving a more systematic foundation to a judgment of what actually are the behaviors that are most problematic for society and that therefore the criminal justice system should address. So I think that is certainly more in line with something Beccaria would support than some of the applications of his ideas that were, tried in other times.
Just a very brief on, just to tack on that. I think Beccaria is better at questions than answers. You have to remember what the purpose of the book was. It's not a philosophical treatise. It's his version of the Communist Manifesto. If you want the full argument, you've got to read Das Kapital. He never wrote Das Kapital, so you can't. But then again, a lot of people say, just read the Communist Manifesto. So, it depends what you're looking for. But I think I'm not a Beccaria cheerleader. I came to this, in a neutral way. Others may be more cheerleading than me. I think it's better at provoking questions that we can inquire into further. I think other readings are anachronistic.
Well, I am a Beccaria cheerleader, even though I think Henry Fielding was the founder of criminology, because 10 years before Beccaria, he was writing about gin mills as a cause of violence, and then got the first grant from the Home Office to go out and fight a crime wave by hanging lots of robbers who they caught in highway robberies. But he didn't have the principle of proportionality, which is the moral integration of an empirical claim that Beccaria was making, which is that it's possible to distinguish between too much punishment relative to the harm, as well as too little. And it is that idea which to me has been the most powerful influence on British policing, for example, and the idea of making the, not the punishment fit the crime as much as the process that the police can use. As the commissioner was quoted saying today, we can't decapitate people to unstick them from the highways to clear the M25, because that clearly goes beyond this bounded utilitarianism that Beccaria is describing. And through Bentham and Peel, it was infused into the first set of rules of the Met in 1829 that you could not make actions as police officers that would be disproportionate to the harm that you're trying to prevent. So in that regard, Ancha, I want to say that your discovery that they did statistical studies of sentencing in relation to different kinds of crimes is a major criminological fact, if you will, because it's a response to the implicit invitation in Beccaria that we can figure out what is the minimal pain that we can inflict on people, because the only moral justification for inflicting any pain is to prevent greater amounts of pain. And of course, in terms of methodology, it was greater in asking a question than in giving us the answer. But it sounds like these folks in Austria were jumping right in there with an answer that ultimately became the basis of sentencing guidelines and the crime harm index based on sentencing guidelines in some countries, and in other countries like Canada, based on average sentences, exactly as the Austrian heirs to Beccaria had undertaken. So I've learned an awful lot about those really important themes from the book, and well worth the price. I recommend it. I bought my copy of it.
So, I mean, that would have been Tuscany. I'm not sure to what extent the Austrians took statistics of punishment.
I misunderstood you. I thought you said they were doing studies of average sentencing.
And Leopold, I mean, when he was not yet Leopold II of Austria, but when he was ruler of Tuscany, Grand Duke of Tuscany, this was quite a small district. I mean, I would be surprised if Tuscany, in terms of its population, I mean, it's a bit like compiling statistics, I suppose, for Cambridgeshire and Bedfordshire. You know, so it is more doable. And for that reason, he was able to actually base his code, his first attempt at a criminal code, which was not very systematic, but at least, you know, he had a go at it, on empirical knowledge of what kinds of cases had become before the courts in the last 20 years before I took office. And I was also really fascinated by that, because I thought, I think he did it in part to be able to counteract arguments that, you know, the heavens would fall and, you know, everything, complete insecurity would result from the abolition of the death penalty. But he did look at how many robberies had actually come before the courts, and how many, you know, types of, how many homicides, and so on and so forth. So that in itself, that you have a policy that is imposed by, informed by empirical knowledge of what is actually going on up to that point. I think that was an innovation. And he probably would have carried it across into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that was a far more complicated affair. I mean, what I didn't mention was that during the time of Maria Theresa, and that was when Joseph II, the future Joseph II, would already have been her co-regent, they did produce a compilation of their criminal code. And that was immediately considered an abomination. But as it was pointed out, it was simply a systematization of law already in force. So that still included the crime of witchcraft. That still helpfully set out, even with, you know, pictorial instructions to clarify matters, what forms of torture you could use on the basis of what type of suspicion. So it's an extreme moment where, on the one hand, you have said people and also governments that are sort of committed to modernity and that are quite modern in their thinking. BECCARIA is sort of at the forefront of that. And then you have a legal system in place where which just lags behind unbelievably far. And so it was really interesting to see where, you know, on a similar set of inherited laws, how Leopold Gauck went about reforming it. You know, that he didn't look at the laws as such, but he looked at the cases that had come before the court. I thought that was really, really interesting.
So Manuel has a question, and I suggest that the panelists have not yet preference answering this question.
It wasn't really a question. I just wanted to continue along the lines that Antje was arguing about the importance of Archduke Leopold II. And something that fascinated me was that, you know, the supposed difference between legal philosophy and positivism actually breaks down when you look at this period, because what Archduke Leopold II was very interested in was also creating some crime statistics, differentiating by age, by social background, what regions, how regions differed in their levels of crime. So this idea of trying to learn something about harm and where harm happens, and then think about what's to do better than just punishing, was very much born together with the idea of a more enlightened punishment system. That's my reading of what was happening in Tuscany.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words in response to the last two comments. Well, I think that BECCARIA was clearly much better at posing questions, and it wasn't explicitly then answered by many people. But in the US, for example, one school of thinking that picked on BECCARIA's project was law and economics, and nowadays it would be the behavioral economics. It goes all the way back to the 70s, where Baker wrote an article of the sort of a BECCARIan foundation of understanding of criminal justice. So, like, it's not to say that BECCARIA would have agreed with this idea, but it is to say that so many people have engaged with the questions posed by BECCARIA, and notably the question of, well, how do we quantify, how do we put a cost to crime? And that seemed to have become a central question of policy. And other, other thinkers such as Foucault obsessed about this for the opposite reasons, namely, BECCARIA was the worst evil because he disciplined the punishment. He made it rational. He made it look like the state can punish, in a rational way, and so he made the punishment and policing so much more dangerous for the rest of the population. So again, this is just to highlight that BECCARIA was putting his finger on crucial issues of how to think about criminology and crime in a secular way when you put aside all kind of theological sort of apparatus and start thinking about the empirical questions of criminology.
Pick up on that and to respond to both Lawrence and Manuel. BECCARIA did ask questions, but he also led the way to the answers. So he was very sketchy about empiricism, but he was sure that the answer would be empiricism. He gave those, made those suggestions about the outcome of experiments, but he was well aware that he was not making the experiments, which means that while secularizing criminal law, he said, okay, if it's secularized, it's not a matter of some sort of fire and mysticism. What you need to find answers as there really are here. So I think in that sense, he would be, here I'm answering Sandra. Yes, Sandra, that what did BECCARIA think if he came here to the institute? He would have been delighted to see the empirical study that's being done here. He would have gone from room to room and it would be like a camp shop.
More specifically to one room, I would suspect.